We sold the house, sweetheart. The words slammed into me like a truck, knocking the air from my lungs. I gripped the edge of the dining table, my vision blurring as a suffocating silence fell over the room. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it was trying to break free from my chest. I wanted to believe I had misheard, that this was some cruel joke, but the smug expression on Uncle Raymond's face told me otherwise. My fingers tightened into fists. I could feel my nails digging into my palms, but I didn't care. Across from me, Aunt Linda sipped her wine with a lazy smirk, as if she hadn't just ripped apart everything my grandfather built. My cousins, Brandon and Jessica, sat beside her, their eyes gleaming with amusement, barely hiding their satisfaction. You. What? My voice came out in a whisper, barely containing the raw fury bubbling beneath my skin. Uncle Raymond leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with a look of fake sympathy. It was for the best, Evelyn. That house was old, falling apart. We all agreed it was time to move on. Move on. That house wasn't some abandoned property. It was my grandfather's legacy. It was the place where I grew up, where I learned how to ride a bike, where Grandpa tucked me in at night and told me stories about how he built it brick by brick with his own hands. I clutched the letter in my hands, Grandpa's will, the paper trembling slightly from the force of my grip. My eyes darted across the words I had read 100 times over, the words that made my stomach twist into a knot. To my beloved granddaughter, Evelyn Langford, I leave my house and all its contents. This home is your legacy. Protect it. It was mine. And yet, these people, my own blood, had taken it from me, stolen it like thieves in the night. Aunt Linda sighed, shaking her head as if I were an unruly child throwing a tantrum. Sweetheart, don't be dramatic. Grandpa was gone. The house was just sitting there collecting dust. It's not like you could afford to keep it anyway. Selling was a smart thing to do. Brandon let out a short laugh. Some investor guy offered us cash. It was quick, easy money. Easy money. The rage that burned in my chest was almost unbearable. They thought this was over. They thought they had won. But what they didn't know was that Grandpa always had a backup plan. The day I got the call about Grandpa's passing, my world shattered. I had been sitting in my tiny apartment when my phone rang, the lawyer's voice grim. My coffee mug slipped from my fingers, shattering against the floor, but I barely noticed. My hands trembled as I booked the first flight home, my mind replaying every unmade phone call, every visit I had postponed because of work. I had planned to see him. I had planned to call, but time is cruel. It steals what you love before you even realize it's gone. When I arrived, the house looked exactly the same. The white picket fence, the sprawling front porch, the massive oak tree where Grandpa and I had carved our names when I was 8. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The warmth was gone. The bookshelves that once overflowed with Grandpa's favorite novels were half empty. The walls, stripped of the photos that once told the story of our family, looked hollow. The air, once filled with the comforting scent of cinnamon and old wood, now felt cold. And then I saw them, my family, sitting around Grandpa's dining table, drinking his expensive wine, acting as if they had always belonged there, as if they weren't the same people who had abandoned him. That's when I knew. They had already made their move. They had stolen what was mine before I even had a chance to fight for it. But here's the thing about Arthur Langford: he never left anything to chance. And if my greedy, self serving family thought they could erase his legacy with one quick sale, if they thought they had won, they were about to learn the hard way just how much of a fighter I really was. I took a slow, steady breath, forcing myself to smile as I met Uncle Raymond's arrogant gaze. So you sold it? My voice was eerily calm. Brandon grinned. Yup, quick and easy. No need to thank us. They had no idea. no idea that they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Because as I slipped Grandpa's will into my purse, I could feel the weight of a secret he had once told me. A secret none of them knew. A secret that would change everything. I didn't say another word. I just stood there, staring at the people I once called family, feeling the weight of betrayal settle deep in my chest. My fingers tightened around my purse, where Grandpa's will sat hidden like a ticking time bomb. They thought they had won, but they had no idea what was coming. I forced a slow breath, calming the fire raging inside me. If I exploded now, if I screamed, cried, or made a scene, it would be exactly what they wanted. They expected me to be weak. They expected me to break. Instead, I smiled. Uncle Raymond's smirk faltered just slightly. Aunt Linda's fingers paused against her wine glass. Jessica and Brandon looked at each other, suddenly unsure. They had no idea why I wasn't reacting. They had no idea why I wasn't begging. And that was my first victory. Who exactly did you sell it to? I asked, my voice smooth, controlled. Brandon shrugged, taking another sip of his drink. Some investment guy. Name was. What was it, Jess? Jessica twirled a strand of her perfectly styled blonde hair, looking bored. Jonathan. Or maybe it was James. Who cares? He paid cash, and he wasn't interested in haggling. Cash. Quick sale. No questions. They had sold it for less than its worth just to get rid of it fast. That meant one thing: they were hiding something. I tilted my head, pretending to be thoughtful. Did he sign everything already? Finalized it? Uncle Raymond narrowed his eyes. He knew something was off. Why are you asking? I met his gaze head on, my smile unwavering. Oh, just curious. I could feel the tension shift in the room. They weren't sure if they had actually won anymore. They weren't sure if I knew something they didn't. And they were right to be worried, because Grandpa never trusted them, and neither did I. I needed to get out of there. The longer I stayed, the harder it was to hold back the burning rage in my chest. If I stayed any longer, I might just let them see exactly how much they had messed up. So I turned, grabbing my coat from the chair. Where are you going? Aunt Linda asked, her voice laced with amusement, as if she still believed she held all the power. I just remembered I have some business to take care of, I said, keeping my tone light. Oh, and by the way, I let my gaze linger on Uncle Raymond just a second longer. You should always read the fine print. And then I walked out. As soon as I was outside, I let out a shaky breath, the cold night air doing nothing to cool the fire inside me. I pulled out my phone and dialed the one person who could help me now. He answered on the second ring. Evelyn? Mr. Carter, I said, gripping the phone tight. I need to meet right now. It's about Grandpa's house. There was a pause, and then his voice came firm and steady. Come to my office. We need to talk. I didn't waste a second. 15 minutes later, I was standing in Mr. Carter's office, my pulse racing. He was Grandpa's lawyer, the only person my grandfather ever fully trusted. And right now, he was my only hope. He studied me carefully, then reached into his desk, pulling out a folder, one I had never seen before. Your grandfather knew this would happen, Mr. Carter said, sliding the folder toward me. And he left behind a plan, a very specific plan. I opened the folder, my hands trembling, and that's when I saw it: a backup deed, a secret contract, a hidden clause in the will that no one else knew about. And at that moment, I realized something that made my breath hitch in my throat. My greedy family thought they had stolen my inheritance, but they had actually sold something they never legally owned in the first place. The house was still mine. I looked up at Mr. Carter, my heart pounding with adrenaline, with fire, with the sweet, intoxicating taste of revenge settling on my tongue. Tell me exactly what I need to do next. He leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. Are you ready to take them down? I grinned, feeling the power surge through my veins. Oh, Mr. Carter, they have no idea what's coming for them. I walked out of Mr. Carter's office with a plan, a purpose, and a fire burning in my chest so intense it could have burned the whole city down. My greedy, backstabbing family had no idea what they had done. They thought they had stolen my inheritance, but in reality, they had just dug their own graves. I clutched the hidden deed in my hands, my mind racing with possibilities. Grandpa was a genius. He had known they would betray me. He had seen it coming before I had, and he had made sure I still had the upper hand. The house was never truly theirs to sell. They had scammed themselves. I could have gone straight back to that dinner table and watched the blood drain from their smug faces as I told them the truth. But that wasn't enough. They deserved to suffer. They needed to feel the same crushing weight of betrayal that I had felt, the humiliation, the downfall, the absolute destruction. So instead of confronting them, I set a trap. The next morning, I made my first move. I found out where the so called buyer of the house was staying, a man named Jonathan Pierce, a high end real estate investor with deep pockets and a reputation for flipping properties fast. He thought he had gotten the deal of a lifetime. He had no idea that he had just purchased a house that still legally belonged to me. I didn't call him, I didn't send an email. I walked straight into his office, unannounced, and dropped the real deed on his desk. He barely looked up at first, too busy tapping away on his keyboard. I'm in the middle of something, miss. Read it, I interrupted, my voice sharp as a knife. Something in my tone made him pause. He leaned forward, flipping the first page, then the second. And by the time he reached the third, his face had turned completely pale. This, this can't be right, he muttered, his voice shaking. He looked up at me, eyes wide. I owned the house. The sale was finalized. The paperwork. The paperwork was a scam. I cut in. The people who sold it to you never legally owned it. My grandfather left the house to me in his will. That contract in your hands, that's the real legal deed. Which means. I leaned in, lowering my voice to a deadly whisper. You don't own anything. Silence. I watched as realization dawned on his face like a storm breaking over the ocean. He had just spent millions on a property that was never up for sale. He was screwed, and he knew it. He ran a shaky hand through his hair. This this is a nightmare, he muttered. I'm going to sue them. I'll have them arrested. Oh, don't worry, I said, standing up. I have a better idea. Because taking legal action was one thing, but ruining their lives from the inside out, that was so much more satisfying. I laid out my plan, and Jonathan Pierce, once my enemy, now my unexpected ally, nodded along, his expression shifting from horror to pure vengeful excitement. You really are Arthur Langford's granddaughter, aren't you? He murmured, almost in awe. I smiled, a slow, wicked smile that held nothing but fire. You have no idea. It was time to bring them down, and I was going to make sure they never saw it coming. I walked out of Jonathan Pierce's office, feeling like a queen ready for war. My enemies weren't faceless strangers. They weren't corporate giants or distant rivals. They were my own flesh and blood. And they had no idea that the storm was coming. Jonathan wasted no time. He was furious, humiliated, and determined to destroy the people who had scammed him. But instead of going straight to the police or filing a lawsuit, we set the trap, the best kind of revenge, the one where your enemies don't see the knife until it's already in their back. We needed to make them feel safe. We needed to make them believe they had gotten away with it. So we played along. Jonathan made no move to expose the truth. Instead, he contacted my uncle Raymond and my dear Aunt Linda and told them that he had loved the property so much that he wanted to buy more. Of course, The moment they heard more money, they came running like the greedy rats they were. Jonathan set up a fake meeting, pretending to bring in other investors while I stayed hidden in the shadows, watching every move they made. I watched Uncle Raymond laugh, his voice dripping with arrogance as he bragged about sealing the best deal of his life. I watched Aunt Linda sip her expensive wine, her eyes gleaming as she plotted ways to squeeze even more money out of Jonathan. I watched Brandon and Jessica whisper to each other, already spending the money they thought was coming. They were too blinded by greed to even notice the sword hanging over their heads. Jonathan led them on for 2 weeks, feeding them false promises of a massive payout if they just invested in a bigger deal. And like the fools they were, they poured every last penny into it, their savings, their cars, their business accounts, even their personal properties. Every last cent. And then, just when they thought they were about to triple their money, the truth hit them like a wrecking ball. The papers they had signed, fake. The investors they thought they were working with, actors. The deal they thought they had made, a carefully crafted lie. And just as reality started to sink in, just as panic spread across their faces, I stepped out from the shadows. Their eyes went wide when they saw me. Shock, confusion, fear. Surprise, I said, my voice dripping with satisfaction. Uncle Raymond's face turned ghostly white. Aunt Linda gasped. Jessica's wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the table. Evelyn, Brandon stammered, what are you doing here? I took my time walking around the room, dragging my fingers across the luxurious table they had bought with stolen money. I wanted to watch your little empire crumble, I said sweetly. Up close and personal. Aunt Linda shot to her feet. You don't understand? Oh, I understand perfectly. I caught her off, leaning in. I understand that you thought you could cheat me. I understand that you thought you could erase Grandpa's legacy with a quick sale and some dirty money. I pulled out the real deed and slammed it onto the table. I understand that you never legally owned the house, which means you never had the right to sell it. Silence. Dead, cold, silence. And then, chaos. Aunt Linda started screaming. Uncle Raymond's hands shook. Brandon and Jessica looked like they were about to pass out. You, you set us up, Uncle Raymond roared. I smiled, slow and wicked. Oh, Uncle, you did that all by yourself. Their accounts were empty. Their assets were gone. They had lost everything. And then, just when they thought it couldn't get worse, the police walked in because while Jonathan had played the long game, I had been busy making sure the law was on my side. Fraud, illegal sales, financial crimes, every single dirty trick they had used, it was all documented. And as the officers slapped the handcuffs onto my uncle's wrists, I leaned in, whispering the final words that sealed their fate. Grandpa always knew you were snakes. I turned to leave, feeling lighter than I had in years. The house was mine. Their greed had destroyed them. And Arthur Langford, his legacy was safe. I stood in the doorway, watching as everything they had built on lies came crashing down around them. Uncle Raymond thrashed against the officers holding him, his face red with rage. You little snake, you set us up. Aunt Linda was in tears, her perfectly styled hair falling out of place as she screamed, This is a mistake. You can't do this to us. Brandon and Jessica, frozen, speechless, completely and utterly destroyed. I tilted my head, drinking in the chaos like it was the finest glass of champagne. Oh, Uncle, I said sweetly, you did this to yourselves. I just made sure you fell as hard as possible. The officers started leading them out, but I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. I strolled forward, slow and deliberate, stopping just inches away from them. I wanted them to feel my presence. I wanted them to understand deep in their bones that this was the price of betrayal. By the way, I whispered, just loud enough for them to hear. Remember that money Jonathan promised you? The big deal you all invested in? Aunt Linda stilled. Uncle Raymond's eyes widened. That was fake, too, I said, grinning. Every last dollar you had? Gone. I watched it sink in. The real horror. The moment when they realized they weren't just losing the house, they were losing everything. Their accounts drained, their properties seized, their reputation destroyed. Uncle Raymond let out a strangled curse, his body sagging against the officers. Aunt Linda shook her head wildly, muttering, No, 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 this can't be happening. This can't be real. Brandon and Jessica were too stunned to even speak. Oh, but it is, I said, tilting my head. Enjoy prison, Uncle. I'm sure you'll make plenty of new friends in there. And with that, I turned on my heel and walked away. I didn't look back, because their world was burning to the ground, and I had no reason to stay and watch the ashes fall. I had won, but this wasn't just about winning. This was about justice. This was about avenging Grandpa. And now, for the first time in a long time, I felt free. The house was mine again. But more than that, I had buried my past where it belonged. I walked through the front doors of Grandpa's home, taking a deep breath, letting the familiar scent of aged wood and cinnamon wrap around me like a long lost hug. I did it, Grandpa, I whispered. And in that moment, I swore I could almost hear him laughing in approval. I had restored his legacy. I had taken down the ones who tried to erase it. And now, it was time to start over. Time to live. The house was mine again. I had won. The people who betrayed me had been crushed under the weight of their own greed. My so called family had lost everything. They had played their game and thought they had won, but in the end, they never stood a chance. Now they were nothing. Gone. Out of my life forever. And yet, something felt wrong. I should have been celebrating. I should have felt untouchable. But as I stepped inside the house, Grandpa's house, the air felt heavier, thicker. It was quiet, too quiet. For months, I had fought for this moment, for the justice Grandpa deserved. I had plotted, schemed, set my traps, and watched them fall one by one. I had buried my past where it belonged. So why did it feel like the past was still watching me? I dropped my purse onto the kitchen counter, my fingers brushing over the old wooden table where Grandpa and I had shared countless meals, countless memories. The house still smelled like him, a mix of aged wood, cinnamon, and something warm, familiar. The scent hit me like a wave, knocking the air from my lungs. I hadn't let myself grieve. I had been too angry, too focused on revenge, too consumed by the war I had waged. But now there was nothing left to fight. And suddenly, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was lonely. I walked through the house slowly, my fingers trailing over the furniture, the picture frames, the walls that had once been filled with laughter. I could almost hear Grandpa's voice, the way he used to hum to himself while reading, the way he'd chuckle when he caught me sneaking extra cookies from the jar. I did it, Grandpa, I whispered. I protected our home. I made them pay. Silence. A deep ache settled in my chest. He should have been here to see it. He would have smirked, patted my shoulder, maybe even called me a clever little fox, the way he always did when I managed to outsmart someone. But he wasn't here. He never would be again. I turned toward the hallway, a familiar creak echoing beneath my feet, and then another creak behind me. I froze. My breath hitched. I knew this house, every inch of it. And that sound? That wasn't me. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the empty living room. The shadows stretched long and dark, the light outside dimming as the sun began to set. My heart pounded. I was alone, wasn't I? I shook my head, trying to push away the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe I was just exhausted. The past few weeks had been nothing but stress and adrenaline, constant battles and mind games. I needed sleep. I walked toward the staircase, gripping the wooden railing. The second floor was where Grandpa's old study was, the room I hadn't touched yet, the room where he had spent hours, days, years, working on things he never talked about. The one room in the house that had always felt like it held secrets. As I climbed the steps, I swore I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around. Nothing, just the empty hallway below. I exhaled sharply, muttering to myself, "Get a grip, Evelyn. You're being paranoid." But still, the feeling wouldn't go away. I reached Grandpa's study, the door slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The scent of old books and leather filled the air. Everything was exactly as he had left it: his wooden desk, his collection of antique clocks, the shelves lined with thick, weathered novels. But then, my eyes caught something that made my stomach twist. A letter. Sitting on the desk, I stepped forward slowly, my pulse quickening. This wasn't here before. And yet it looked old, aged, as if it had been sitting there for years, just waiting for me to find it. With trembling fingers, I picked it up and flipped it over. My name was written on the front: Evelyn. My breath caught in my throat. I sank into the leather chair, my fingers carefully unfolding the fragile paper. And then I began to read. Evelyn, if you're reading this, then things have gone exactly as I expected. They took the bait, and now it's time for you to finish what I started. There's one last secret in this house. Find it. And when you do, you'll know exactly what to do next. My entire body went cold. This letter wasn't new. Grandpa had written it before he died. He had planned for this. He had known they would betray me. He had known they would try to take the house. He had set a trap for them before I had even realized what they were doing. But that last part: there's one last secret in this house. Find it. A slow chill ran down my spine. Because in all the years I had lived here, Grandpa had never once mentioned a secret. I scanned the room, suddenly hyper aware of every object, every shadow, every little thing that felt out of place. There was something here, something he wanted me to find. And if Grandpa had gone through the trouble of hiding it, it was something big. I stood up slowly, heart pounding, because for the first time since reclaiming this house, I realized this wasn't over. Not yet. And whatever Grandpa had hidden, it was about to change everything. My hands trembled as I held the letter. Grandpa knew. He had known everything before it even happened. He had predicted the betrayal. He had seen it coming long before I ever did. And instead of stopping it, he had let it play out because he wanted them to think they had won, because he had set a trap. I could barely breathe as my eyes scanned the words over and over. There's one last secret in this house. Find it. And when you do, you'll know exactly what to do next. The study suddenly felt different. I had spent years in this room growing up, sitting at the desk while Grandpa worked, running my fingers along the old bookshelves, spinning in his leather chair. I had touched every single thing in this room, and yet I had never thought to look deeper. I set the letter down and forced myself to breathe. Okay, Grandpa, I whispered. Where did you hide it? The walls seemed to close in around me. The dim lighting of the study cast strange shadows across the floor, making the old bookshelves look taller, the desk somehow larger, heavier, as if the entire room had been waiting for this moment. I started at the desk. I pulled open drawers, ran my fingers over the polished wood, checking for hidden compartments. Nothing. Then I turned to the bookshelves. Grandpa's collection was enormous. Hundreds of books, some old enough that their covers were peeling, fragile. My fingers brushed along the spines, searching for something, anything that felt out of place. And then I saw it: a single book. Not old like the others, newer, A black leather cover with no title, no author, just sitting there in the middle of a row of books that had probably been untouched for years. I reached for it, heart pounding. The moment I pulled it, I heard a click. The entire shelf shifted. I stumbled back as the heavy wooden shelf creaked forward, revealing a hidden space behind it, a small, dark opening in the wall. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a secret compartment. This was a hidden room. I swallowed hard, reaching into the gap and pushing the shelf further open. Dust filled the air, the scent of aged wood and something unfamiliar surrounding me. My pulse hammered as I stepped inside. The space was small, cramped, barely big enough for a person to stand in. It was lined with old wooden panels, the floor covered in a layer of dust so thick it looked untouched for decades, and in the middle of it, a metal box. I knelt down, my fingers shaking as I lifted it. The weight of it sent a shiver up my spine. Whatever was inside, Grandpa had made sure no one else ever found it. I took a deep breath and unlatched the lid. Inside, there were documents, old yellowed papers, but as I lifted them, I realized these weren't just any documents. They were legal papers, contracts, bank statements, a ledger filled with names, transactions, dates that went back over 40 years, and at the very bottom, a letter. I unfolded it slowly, and the moment I saw the first line, my entire world stopped. Evelyn, by now you know that this house is more than just a home. It is a vault, a secret, a piece of a story that was never supposed to be told. And now, it is your story to finish. I swallowed hard, scanning the rest of the letter with wide, disbelieving eyes. Grandpa had been hiding something bigger than I could have ever imagined. He wasn't just protecting the house, he was protecting something that could ruin lives. And now, that burden belonged to me. A sharp creak echoed through the house. I froze. The air shifted. I wasn't alone. I shot to my feet, clutching the box as I listened. The house was supposed to be empty. I had made sure of it. But somewhere downstairs, a floorboard groaned. Someone was here, and they were coming for me. The realization sent a bolt of fear through my veins. My mind raced. Had I been followed? Had my greedy family somehow discovered there was more to the house than they thought? I had no time to think. I shoved the papers back into the box and tucked it under my arm. Another footstep. Closer. I reached for the heavy bookcase and slammed it shut, sealing the hidden room behind me just as I heard the sound of the front door clicking open. Whoever was here, they weren't breaking in. They had a key. I moved quickly, stepping back into the shadows of the study just as the soft creak of the floorboards made its way toward the stairs. I had played the game against my family and won. But now, a new game had begun, and I had no idea who I was up against. The air felt like it had been sucked out of the room. I stood there, gripping the heavy metal box, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. Jonathan's words echoed in my head, each one like a warning bell ringing through my skull. We need to destroy that box. My fingers tightened around the cold edges. Why? My voice was barely above a whisper. Jonathan hesitated, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark with something I'd never seen in him before: fear. Because your grandfather wasn't just protecting his house, he said finally. He was protecting the secret that could get you killed. The room spun. My body went cold. Killed? Jonathan nodded slowly, his expression grave. Evelyn, that box holds something powerful, something dangerous. And now that it's in your hands, you have two options. Either you destroy it, or you spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. A cold sweat broke out on my skin. I swallowed hard, my grip tightening on the box. What the hell had Grandpa been hiding? I needed answers. Now. Ignoring Jonathan's warning, I flipped the latches open. He cursed under his breath. stepping forward as if to stop me, but it was too late. The lid creaked as I lifted it. Inside were documents, pages upon pages of yellow, delicate paper, aged contracts, secret ledgers, bank statements. But they weren't just normal financial records. They told a story that had been buried for decades. And as I skimmed the first page, my blood turned to ice. The documents weren't just about my grandfather, they were about Raymond, about Aunt Linda, about my entire family. Their crimes, their fraud, their backdoor deals, their stolen money, their ties to something much bigger than just real estate, blackmail, extortion, political bribery. I flipped through the pages, my breath catching in my throat. Names, dates, figures so high they made my head spin. And then, at the very bottom of the pile, a photograph. I picked it up with shaking hands. It was an old, grainy picture of my grandfather, but he wasn't alone. Standing next to him were three other men, dressed in suits. Their faces were stern, their eyes dark, filled with something calculated, ruthless. I flipped it over. On the back, written in Grandpa's familiar, neat handwriting, was a single sentence. If you're reading this, they already know. My stomach dropped. I knew those men. Even though the photo was old, even though time had worn their faces, I recognized at least two of them. They were powerful men, untouchable men, men who still walk the streets today, their names whispered in government offices and corporate boardrooms. And they were connected to my family. I looked up at Jonathan, my breath unsteady. What? What is this? His expression was grim. Proof? Proof of what? I demanded. Proof that your family wasn't just greedy, Evelyn, he said. They were involved in something bigger, something criminal. The room tilted. My hands trembled. This wasn't just about the house. This was about decades of corruption. Grandpa hadn't left me a house. He had left me a loaded gun. And the second I opened that box, I had pulled the trigger. A sudden noise shattered the silence. A car engine. Outside. I turned toward the window, my chest tightening as I saw a sleek black car pull up in front of the house. Then another, and another. Three in total. The doors opened simultaneously. Men in dark suits stepped out. Their movements were calm, precise, methodical. Not police, not reporters. Something worse. Evelyn, Jonathan whispered urgently. We need to go. Now. I backed away from the window, my heart slamming against my ribs. How had they found me so fast? Jonathan grabbed my arm. We can't fight them. We need to run. We need to disappear. Disappear. But my mind wasn't on escaping. It was on Grandpa's last message. If you're reading this, they already know. He had planned for this. He had known this day would come, and yet he had still left the choice to me. Run or fight. My pulse roared in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to flee. But then I thought of Grandpa. I thought of how hard he had fought to protect this secret, how much he had sacrificed, how much he had trusted me. And I knew. I couldn't run. I wouldn't. I turned to Jonathan, my jaw set. No, he blinked. Evelyn, this isn't a game. These men don't negotiate. Neither do I. I grabbed the documents, stuffing them back into the box. Then I pulled out my phone and snapped photo after photo, saving everything. Jonathan exhaled sharply. Damn it, Evelyn. The front door burst open. I turned just as the men stepped inside, their expressions cold, unreadable. One of them, a tall man with ruthless eyes, locked his gaze on me. Miss Langford, he said smoothly, you've inherited something that doesn't belong to you. I smiled, a slow, wicked smile. Funny, I said, crossing my arms. That's exactly what I told my family. The man's lips curled slightly, but his eyes remained void of emotion. You don't know what you're getting into. Neither did my grandfather, I shot back. And look how far he got. A long silence. Then the man reached into his suit jacket. Jonathan tensed beside me, but the man didn't pull out a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a single slip of paper, a contract. And when he handed it to me, I felt the weight of fate itself settling onto my shoulders. Sign this, he said, and we forget you ever existed. I looked down at the paper, and at the bottom, in dark inked letters, was the price of my silence. $10 million. I felt Jonathan stiffen beside me. Evelyn, he murmured, his voice tight. You don't have to do this. But I wasn't listening, because in that moment, I finally understood. This wasn't about money, this was about power. I looked up at the man, my grip tightening on the contract. And then, very slowly, I tore it in half. The man's smile vanished. Jonathan cursed under his breath, and as the pieces fluttered to the ground, I took a step forward, meeting the man's cold stare with one of my own. Tell your boss, I said quietly, that the game just changed. Silence. Then, a slow nod. The man turned on his heel, walking out the door. His men followed. And just like that, they were gone. Jonathan let out a long breath, shaking his head. You just made a very dangerous enemy, Evelyn. I smiled. Good, because I wasn't done yet. Not even close. And this time, I was playing for blood.